Pastor, doesn't science disprove the Bible?
Isn't Genesis just a fairy tale?
Is God for...
All right, tonight, are we descended from apes, monkey business? They call them missing links because they're still missing. We'll look at that evidence tonight. I love that. I was really fascinated when previewing this program, and the fact they really gave me, I've been doing this stuff now for 38 years, and they showed me some stuff on missing links that I did not know. It was additional ammo, and so I was happy to see this. We still do offer both Jack's book and mine for donations, and they're up there on our website. Tonight we'll be looking at monkey business, and next month, dinosaurs in the Bible with Dr. Ken Harris. Carl, how you doing?
Does COVID still do anything actively?
COVID?
COVID. Ken COVID with me.
No, he has a very tough time doing anything because he's been frozen out of the ministry by the sun.
Yeah, I know about that. I figured you'd start something else.
Not to my knowledge. Huh? You can give it to Carl if you, or I'll take it, and it's up to him how much he wants to do. We've got some people that he gave me a dues check. He's got a dues check. I'll take him to deposit on it if you don't have the time right now. Pray for spiritual healing in our nation and our leaders. Pray for SABBS' public seminars and radio ministry. Pray for effectiveness of monthly meetings and speakers. Pray for Israel and Ukraine. And pray for Miss Cindy Williams and family. Carl, you want me to share that? Okay. Cindy now is in hospice. And so, again, prayers for her and the family are greatly appreciated. And we'll do that to open with prayer.
How's your brother-in-law?
My brother-in-law got off a ventilator for 26 minutes today before he got put back on. But if they get him off the ventilator, it will simply take a miracle from God. Because he's got failing organs, including both kidneys. His white count is at 4,800. That's down from 5,500 when he checked into the hospital. He's got he may have leukemia. There's some type of infection they can't identify. But anyway, Lord God, forgive us for sins and put us in a proper fellowship with you. Thank you for a beautiful day. Spring is a great time of year that you designed. We do pray for all of these things that we've asked for with prayer concerns for SABBS, our ministry, for Cindy and Carl and the Williams. We also pray for my brother-in-law and her and my sister's family. In each one of these cases, we ask for your best and your will. Lord God, now let the Spirit show us what you want us to see in your word and your world. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Hard copies of the communicator back there. If you're signed up with us, you're getting this online. We have Nature's Wonder, A Tale of Two Scientists. The Cell is an embedded computing system re-examining the arguments for the existence of God. That was from that is a new Christian who was the co-founder of Wikipedia, thank you. Plant Missile Technology, A Peek in the Armory, and our Genesis commentary. There's the new lineup of our programs on believing the Bible. This is all on our website if you ever want to look it up and see what's coming. We are now contracted for 5 new venues, markets, and 10 new stations. The big one was getting into Dallas-Fort Worth, which is exceptional. There is now a list of the 22 U.S. markets and 37 stations with a potential audience over 35 million that our program is now being heard. I will, as it says in the newsletter, if you ever want to help support this project, either with a one-time gift or a monthly sponsorship, it will be appreciated. We are now spending over $1,800 a month and $20,000 a year to be in those 22 markets.
Amen.
We do have our normal provision of stuff. We have the free table back there on the right, tape on the left, and more paid materials up here. We're still doing fourth Tuesdays at Faith Chapel for at Calvary Chapel for the homeschoolers. This month we'll be doing Doesn't Distant Starlight Prove the Bible is Wrong? Next month we will be looking at Dinosaurs in the Bible with Dr. Ken Harris. All right, I'm going to get out of this. Any thoughts or questions before I start the program?
Jesus often taught in parables. A parable is a story with a much deeper spiritual meaning. A few years ago, I thought, how can I best explain what's going on in our culture where children are taught only one viewpoint about where everything came from, that everything made itself, that the parts came together, that chemicals came alive, that the DNA code wrote itself. And I realized probably the best way to do this is through a story. You see, many years ago, in a deep, dark jungle of South America, there lived a tribe who had never been exposed to modern technology. There were not even any other tribes anywhere near them. As far as they knew, they were the only people on Earth. Well, one day, one of these tribe members ventured a little farther away than he'd normally been from his village, and he found a structure that he had no idea what it was. He'd never seen anything like it. It had a smooth surface. It had long, flat panels sticking out from the sides. He cleared off the vines and then ran back to the village and brought others back to see it. A debate raged among the villagers. What was this structure? Was it a natural object that had just somehow made itself there in the jungle? Or had this been something that was made by other human beings? Apparently human beings far more intelligent and advanced than even they were. They realized there could not be anybody more advanced, more intelligent than us. We are the pinnacle of the intelligence of life here on this planet. The other villagers said, no, it's obvious. It's been designed, it's been constructed. Some other sort of people must have made it. Meanwhile, they continued to study this object. They discovered that its colored surface was very similar to different colors that oozed out of berries that could be smeared to paint surfaces. They discovered that the round, rather rubbery kind of things underneath of this structure were similar to sap that oozed out of trees, and if left in the sun, they turned into a soft rubbery type substance. They discovered that the clear, transparent thing at the front, behind what looked like a seat, was similar to when lightning would strike a beach and turn sand into a glassy-like substance. So they reasoned, because all of these things could occur naturally, this object must have made itself. So they learned they could repair this. They knew where the parts had come from, they learned how to repair it, and they taught others, this proves this object made itself. And yet there were stubborn members of the tribe that continued to say, no, it's obviously been designed, there has to be an intelligent designer. Those in the camp that thought the object had made itself, that there couldn't be other intelligence outside of themselves, decided they would organize village schools, and they took the children from the entire village and they showed them only the evidence that seemed to support their viewpoint, who then became the teachers and taught the next generation. And within several generations, everybody in the village now knew this object, this airplane, had built itself by some natural forces yet to be discovered. And no one doubted it. Now, what is the point? That's exactly what's going on all around us. It is assumed the complexity of life made itself. It is assumed that something turned into human beings, because the only alternative is that we were fully formed, fully functional by an incredible, intelligent designer, God Himself. And that's the subject of this lesson. For this episode, I'd like to go to the culmination of the evolutionary story, which is, where did man come from? Did we really start out as just goo in some pond or ocean somewhere, and then, like visiting a zoo, we changed from one animal to another, and eventually turned into a monkey that eventually turned into you, from goo to you by way of the zoo? Or are there problems with this story that you're really not being shown? We're at a typical zoo in the chimpanzee ape section. I want to show you how deceptive it is as young children come through these kind of displays. For instance, this is a sign that supposedly shows the transformation from an ape-like creature to a human being. Notice how it starts. Chimpanzees are our closest relatives, stated as a fact, not a theory, a fact. And then, as you're about to hear from the expert Chris Roop, as he walks through each of these supposed ancestors of ours, notice what's on the panorama of this park sign. It shows ape-like creatures swinging from the trees, then a divergence of a chimpanzee in one spot and a supposed apish standing up on the way to becoming a human being in another branch from that ancestor. Then you come to Homo habilis, these ape-like people using tools. Chris, in a few moments, will explain where do those fit in. Then you see Neanderthal. Neanderthals have been shown to be 100% total human beings. And lastly, fully modern humans. The last thing you'll notice on this sign, they show a human foot that's clearly a human foot. They don't show how vastly different an ape or chimpanzee's foot is. Completely different in structure and appearance. That is the kind of thing that leads people to believe they're all just the same, because they don't get to see all the evidence, only an artist's conception of where it all came from. Now, I have to admit, I totally assumed all of this was true as I came through school and was taught evolution. By the time I got out of college, it was a fact in my mind. It was a fact that some sort of ape-like creature turned into a human being. And when I was invited to go to a lecture where someone was going to talk about the problems with evolution, the idea that creation was true, that God had made very different kinds of creatures, to say the very least, I was beyond skeptical. I thought this was total absurdity. Of course it's a fact that apes have turned into people. But what I was not aware of was that there is enormous controversy even among various paleoanthropologists and human anthropologists. They see the problems with the bones, but it's not publicized. It's not talked about in the textbooks in the museums. It's just assumed to be a fact. So why is it so commonly accepted? Basically because it's repeated over and over and over again in the National Geographic magazines, in the public radio broadcasts with the latest ape man link that gets found. Throughout the museums, it's assumed, well, obviously God didn't just make people, so the only option left is that some sort of an ape-like creature turned into a person. Now, I'd like to show you how this idea has grown with time in the mass media. I did a study where I looked at just the covers of National Geographic and Time magazine, two incredibly influential magazines, and I went back and I looked through the decade of the 30s. How many times did evolution or ape people show up on the covers? 0. In the 40s, 0. In the 50s, 0. But by the time we reached the decade of the 60s, as you looked at the covers, this idea of apes transforming themselves into people showed up 1 or 2 times over the whole decade. By the 70s, it was up in the range of about 5 times per decade. You see, it's increasing decade after decade. It's being promoted as a fact that apes turned into people more and more times. By the time you reach the 2010 to 2020 range, we're seeing it almost every other month on one of these magazine covers. The impact of that is to the population at large, the young children who eventually go through school and they become the teachers. It becomes locked as an absolute fact in their thinking. But do the bones support this as reality, or is it really just a misinterpretation and speculation? Rather than myself, who's not an expert, talk about what do these bones show, I'm going to take you for this episode to someone who has spent years studying the technical reports, the actual finds, the bones that supposedly link man to ape. Now that's resulted in a book called Contested Bones, written by Christopher Roop. His degree is in biology, and he's currently working on a PhD in geology, and Dr. John Sanford, an expert in genetics. This is a once-in-a-decade resource. If you really want to see what do the experts say about those bones that have been found, I would strongly urge you to get this resource, Contested Bones, and study it. What you're about to hear from Chris is a brief overview of the disarray that is in the field of human to ape paleoanthropology and the contradictions every step along the way that happen as we truly look at what do these supposed links between man and ape show.
So for the last 7 years, I've been doing research with geneticist Dr. John Sanford of Cornell University, and we've been extensively researching the hominid fossil record, the so-called ape-human intermediates, which a lot of people call missing links. Throughout education systems in the media, really throughout the world, we've been taught that we definitely evolved from ape-like creatures. And in textbooks, they don't teach us as just a hunch in the sense that it's just a theory. No, they teach it as a fact, and they teach it as a scientific fact that really no reasonable person could question. But what I have found that as I did my research in this area and I began to go to school and began to ask people questions about this, I noticed that the average person knows next to nothing about the supposed ape men that they claim were our ancestors. It seems like everywhere we look, we're seeing headlines that say things like missing link or new proof of human evolution. This is pervasive. We see it in Discovery Channel, National Geographic, all over the internet. Textbooks, education systems around the world are teaching as if it were a scientific fact, an unquestionable fact that we definitely evolved from ape-like creatures. What I have found though when talking to students is that very few people have actually done the research. They actually are just basing on what other scientists say, not their own understanding of the topic. So why do so many people believe this? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the so-called ape parade. And I want to show you this book. It's The Early Man. And this was first published in 1965. And in this book there's a foldout, a famous icon of evolution that I think everyone is familiar with. And you'll notice what you see here is a series of ape-like creatures that are becoming progressively more human as they march across the page. Many people just accept that that is a powerful evidence of evolution, even though they admit in the book that it's not based on actual fossil evidence. Before I had met Dr. John Sanford, he had already written a book called Genetic Entropy, and what he shows is that we're not evolving but devolving due to the accumulation of harmful mutations that vastly outnumber any rare beneficials. So Dr. Sanford was very confident that we're definitely not evolving. Yet when you look at the ape-human bones, what do they show? We were really curious about this, and when I came on board with them, I was naturally intrigued. And so for the past 4.5 years, we decided to research the claims made by evolutionary paleontologists. And what we found was that every major claim about these supposed missing links are contested by experts in the field. I think everybody would agree with me that Lucy is perhaps the most famous hominid fossil to have ever been discovered, and is promoted around the world as an absolute missing link between ape and man. But if you ask the general public, what do you know about Lucy, it turns out most people know next to nothing about Lucy, or why we should believe it's our ancestor. Now, when I say Lucy, I'm actually referring to a famous partial skeleton that was discovered in 1974 by Donald Johansen in the Afar region of Ethiopia. That's in East Africa. So where does Lucy belong if we were to imagine for a moment the ape parade? Based on the dating methods, if you accept it for the sake of argument, you would have to say that Lucy lived about 3 to 4 million years ago. And so that would put Lucy at the very back end of the famous ape parade. So it's an apish creature that was on its way to becoming fully human, is the claim that is made. Johansen not only found Lucy is simply the most famous because it's the most complete specimen discovered to date. However, he also found hundreds of other bones. Today they found about 400 additional bones. In his original Nature paper published in 1976, he explained that in his collection of bones there were multiple species. Some were larger and looked just like modern humans, and others were smaller and looked more apish. Just keep that in mind, because not long after that, Donald Johansen would completely change his story. He would then claim that actually all of those bones belonged to a single new species. But that was not what he originally reported. So how did he explain the human-looking bones that were much larger, and the smaller-looking bones that were more ape-like? Well, what he said was that maybe the smaller bones was just due to what's called sexual dimorphism. What that means is that the males were larger and the females were smaller, just like gorillas. The problem with Johansen's claim is that the larger specimens look just like humans in many cases. And so what he said was, well, perhaps the male spent more time on the ground walking upright like modern humans, and the females actually spent most of their time in the trees. Many paleo experts have since called that into question. Many still maintain his original interpretation that actually Lucy's kind is a jumble of multiple species. And in fact, that's actually been claimed in the Journal of Human Evolution, among many other scientific journals. So when we see Lucy in museums and displays, they show her as our ancestor walking upright, yet the public has not been told that there is a number of competing views in the field of paleoanthropology. Many experts in the field doubt Johansson's claim, and they challenge it, and they say actually it appears that Lucy's kind may not even be a real species. In fact, it appears to be a mixture of ape and human bones. But yet this is not the story that we're told in the media and in textbooks. Those competing views are not very widely publicized, even though a large number of paleo experts reject Lucy as their ancestor and reject it as a legitimate species. So in 1974, when Donald Johansson found the famous Lucy skeleton, there were no bones of the hand and feet, actually just an ankle bone and a few toe bones. So there's not enough evidence there to know what Lucy's feet looked like. It was just assumed that Lucy walked upright and had human feet. But why was that? Well, it turns out it wasn't because of the actual skeletal evidence. It was because footprints were found in a different country, in Laetoli, Tanzania, and the footprints, interestingly enough, looked remarkably like modern humans. So they were fossilized in ash, and it was excavated in 1976. It was discovered by Mary Leakey, and she noticed, as many other experts in the field have noticed, the footprints look identical. It's indistinguishable from modern footprints left on a California beach. They say those things. So Johansson made an audacious claim. What he said was perhaps Lucy made those footprints. Now that's hard to imagine because, first of all, Lucy's kind was found 1,000 miles away, and if you accept their dating methods, it dated 500,000 years older. So there's really no way he could know for sure if Lucy could have made those footprints. So if you were to compare a human foot to an ape foot, they look nothing alike because all apes have a divergent thumb-like toe called a hallux that is used for limb grasping. In humans, the fourth toe is in line with the other four. So this is compelling evidence that Lucy's kind actually does not have a human foot at all. Yet if you were to go to natural history museums or look in textbooks, the images that we see of life-size reconstructions of Lucy, they show Lucy from the neck down looking very human, equipped with human hands and human feet. You'll consistently see Johansson's interpretation of the bones that Lucy walked upright. But as I just explained, actually, the bones that they find appear to be just like modern chimpanzees. It's unfortunate that museum displays have not changed and that textbooks are still promoting Lucy as an upright walking ancestor to man with human feet. So now the paleo experts that disagree with Donald Johansson actually look at the foot bones of Lucy's kind and they say, wait a second, this suggests Lucy's kind lived in the trees. It was predominantly a tree-dwelling species, not a habitual upright walker. So this leaves us a mystery. How do you explain the Laetoli footprint trail that looked just like modern human footprints? Well, Johansson has an audacious claim. He says, well, Lucy's kind formed it, even though Lucy doesn't have human feet, and the evidence is not consistent with that. The better explanation is no, maybe the footprints look so human simply because they were formed by humans. Now, evolutionists can't admit that, though. That would actually effectively falsify their current model of human evolution, because according to the standard story, humans are not supposed to have existed during the time of Lucy 3 to 4 million years ago. If you could find human bones and human footprints and human stone tools dating to the time of Lucy, that would totally falsify the popular ape-to-man story, and that is just what we are finding. So it appears that Lucy is not our ancestor. Instead, Lucy's kind coexisted with anatomically modern humans. What did the real Lucy look like? Well, I would say that the broader kind, Lucy's kind, is in fact a mixture and not a real species, just as experts in the field are saying.
Audio Jungle.
Now, evolutionists have long since acknowledged that there is a serious problem for their theory. On one hand, they have the very apish type, which is Lucy's kind. On the other hand, they have the very human type. The problem for evolution has always been to try to find what lies between these two very distinct groups. They tried to fill that gap in 1964 with the announcement of Homo habilis. Homo habilis was based on just very fragmentary bones, some broken portions of the skull, a fragmentary jawbone, and some finger bones. And they nicknamed habilis Handyman. The reason why is because the bones were found with a wealth of stone tools and butchered bones. And so it was clear that whatever was there was butchering animals and eating them and making sophisticated stone tools. Now they had assumed that Homo habilis was the oldest human ancestor. However, many people have called this into question, because they found other bones in the site that are unmistakably human. And it turns out numerous paleoexperts now claim, they have been for years now, saying that Homo habilis is actually an invented species, and they describe it as literally a wastebasket species, the mixture of multiple species. And that's what happens when you find them in a mixed bone bed. They literally put together ape bones with human bones, and what they got was a species that didn't actually exist. Distinguished human evolutionary researcher John Reeder writes, nearly half a century of accumulating evidence and discussion has left Homo habilis more open to question, more insecure than it ever was. Homo habilis remains more of an evolutionary idea than an example of an anatomical fact linking one species to another. And that actually conveys the desperation that paleoexperts have said about Homo habilis. They say that if there wasn't a Homo habilis, we would have to invent one. That shows you how important it is for them to find this critical bridge species to link the earliest apes with humans. Dutch anatomist Eugene Dubois was inspired by Darwin's writing. He was determined to find the missing link between ape and man. This led him to the Indonesian island of Java, and in 1891 he found an isolated skull cap that had some unique features: constricted temples, enlarged brow ridge. At that time he named the species Homo erectus, which means upright ape man, and he claimed that this was our ancestor. This fit with his deeply held conviction that there must be missing links out there somehow. Numerous bones attributed to the species Homo erectus have been found. Unfortunately, most of them are highly fragmentary. There really just wasn't much there. Much of the skeleton was missing. So this led paleoexperts to wonder, what did the real Homo erectus look like? Was it consistent with what Dubois had said, an upright ape man? Or was it perhaps more human? Things changed in 1984 with the discovery of the nearly complete Turkana skeleton found in Kenya. This remarkable discovery showed that Homo erectus is not at all like an upright ape man, not at all like we would think a missing link would be. Instead, the skeleton looks remarkably modern. In fact, many paleoexperts would prefer to reclassify Homo erectus as human. So here's a typical reaction to the Turkana skeleton. John Reeder, an expert in human evolution, he notes, is he a missing link? The answer must be no. Not as a being who stood halfway between the apes and modern humans. The skeleton is too human-like for that. So it is now universally conceded amongst paleoexperts that the real Homo erectus looks just like you and I. The differences are largely confined to the skull. So if you look at many of these different erectus examples, they do have some distinct features, such as enlarged brow ridges, constricted temples, the bump at the back of the skull, reduced chins, a more forward-projecting jaw. So these features have made many people think, well, this is very primitive. The problem is that we find modern human populations with many of the same features. So how do we explain some of these unique features that we see in Homo erectus? For example, on average, the smaller brain case. Well, I want to take you to the Indonesian island of Flores, where paleoexperts in 2004 excavated a partial skeleton, LB1, but they just nicknamed it Hobbit. Now the Hobbit was really interesting because it was contested about how to explain these bones. And a number of experts said, well, this is just a diseased modern human. And others said, well, no, it's a new species. Interestingly enough, not far from the cave, there's a population of small-bodied humans, they're called pygmies, that still live there today. So just like the Hobbit, these individuals are very short, and so there is an explanation for why we can find human skeletons that are much smaller. The Hobbit had a very small brain. Now, some people took this as evidence that was more primitive and less evolved. The problem with that is that when they did endocast scans, which means they looked at the outer surface of the brain that is left on the interior brain case, what they found is that the brain is actually modern. It's not at all primitive, it's just like modern humans. And this fits with the stone tools that we find in the cave. It turns out that the Hobbit was very sophisticated, and we should really call them humans, just as a number of paleoexperts argue. In fact, there's compelling evidence that they had to build a seafaring vessel in order to go against an ocean current to get them to the island of Flores. If you can construct a vessel that can sail against an ocean current, you certainly are pretty intelligent. So how do we explain many of these variants, such as Homo erectus or the Hobbit? I think there's actually a very logical explanation that even evolutionary paleoexperts have suggested. They've noticed that these groups tend to live in small, isolated populations. For example, Homo erectus is described as a nomadic hunter-gatherer people group, and they were very inbred, so in small populations, you're really going to interbreed with each other quite a bit, and that's actually very destructive because you'd accumulate lots of harmful mutations, and those tend to be expressed in small tribes and take on the form of diseases and pathology. In fact, many experts do describe these bones as pathologic. It's very reasonable that this explains some of the unique features, such as their small skulls. So a common theme among these Homo erectus variants and Hobbit is that they lived with very limited resources. So they had low-calorie diets. There wasn't very much food. So what happens in those conditions is you tend to have smaller brain size over a number of generations because you have to expend a lot of calories just to have a large brain. So it would make sense that you would have a smaller brain size just to conserve calories. In fact, I'm not the one suggesting that. Evolutionary scientists have said that it's an example of reductive evolution to result in smaller brain size. Now, that's not evolution because you're actually going the other direction. You're getting smaller, right? And you're not evolving, getting bigger, better, and stronger. On the isolated island of Palau, Lee Berger found a collection of fossils which were unmistakably human, especially in light of their recent date. Interestingly enough, many of the features were remarkably consistent with the Hobbit. Lee Berger describes this collection of human fossils as small in body size, even relative to the pygmy populations from Southeast Asia and Indonesia, and thus may represent a marked case of human insular dwarfism. And now this part I find is very interesting. He actually explains those unique features in small body size due to inbreeding. And so the same logic absolutely applies to Homo erectus, Hobbit, and other small-bodied variants that they would say are different species. In fact, they all appear to be humans that are simply inbred. So the first Neanderthal bones were found in 1856 in Dusseldorf, Germany. Now since then, there's been about 500 different Neanderthal specimens that have been found. So we know what they looked like. We have a lot of clarity now on what the Neanderthals were like. Unfortunately, many people still perceive Neanderthals as these dim-witted, brutish, cavemen-like creatures. And this was really popularized by a fraudulent reconstruction, actually, that was done in the early 1900s by Marcelin Boule. And so he was actually a French anatomist, and when he reconstructed one of the famous Neanderthal skeletons, he took quite a bit of artistic license. So what he did is he actually made the skeleton look more stooped over than it should have been, even though it did have evidence of arthritis. He also took the bones of the foot and a large toe bone he put out to the side to make it look more like a primate foot. And this obviously was to convey that it was an apish creature. Now today, paleo experts unanimously acknowledge that this was a fraudulent reconstruction and went beyond what the actual anatomy suggested in the bones. So what does the real Neanderthal look like? It turns out, because we now have their complete skeletons, we know that Neanderthals were fully human from head to toe. In fact, experts even acknowledge that. Once again, much of the differences are confined to the skull. But in fact, the Neanderthal brain was larger on average than most modern humans. This brings us back to the principle that just because you have a small brain or a large brain doesn't mean you're not human. What's more important is how the brain is organized. So Neanderthals were clearly fully human, especially when you look at their impressive cultural inventory. For example, we know that they were able to control use of fire, they were cooking, they were able to sew, they had jewelry, art, cosmetics. In fact, they even buried their dead, oftentimes with grave goods. So the fact that they're burying their dead shows they believed in an afterlife. That's one of the best evidences you could use to support their fully human status. Once again, most of the unique features are confined to the skull. For example, the pronounced brow ridges or the reduced chin. However, those same features are found in modern human populations today. So that doesn't mean it's because they evolved from a primitive ape. There's a lot of variation in skull shapes, and that's simply because of the diversity we were made with. For example, skulls found in Israel are described by evolutionary paleo experts as Homo sapiens, yet many of their traits overlap extensively with Neanderthals. In fact, some of these specimens, they can't decide whether they're Neanderthals or Homo sapiens, they overlap so much. In 2010, evolutionary geneticists published a draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. So they actually were able to extract DNA from their bones, and the DNA was preserved. When they sequenced it, what was interesting is that the genome is fully human. In fact, this is why many paleo experts now prefer to reclassify Neanderthals as Homo sapiens. In fact, even museum displays are changing. So instead of them looking very apish, they're now actually looking very much like modern humans. The DNA evidence even suggests they had red hair, freckles, and so that's being shown in museum displays today. In the introduction, I showed you the famous ape parade, and we talked about how that's not based on actual fossil evidence. And today, experts in the field unanimously reject that straight-line view of human evolution. Instead, they prefer to describe the fossil record as a messy, tangled bush. It's not even a tree anymore. It's so complex and twisted that they say that it is a messy bush, and they make no apologies for the term. For example, in 2014, Bernard Wood published a tree diagram in Scientific American. And what he shows is a messy, tangled bush. And you'll notice if you look at the diagram that each of the species on these branches are disconnected to the tree. Now that was not done by accident. What he's showing is what has been widely acknowledged by the broader community of paleo experts. What they're saying is that there is no ape-to-man progression seen in the fossil record. Keep in mind that Bernard Wood is a world-renowned paleoanthropologist, so he's an expert in constructing these trees. And he actually admits, he says in Nature News, even with all the fossil evidence and analytical techniques from the past 50 years, a convincing hypothesis for the origin of Homo remains elusive. In fact, that's the whole purpose of human evolution. It's always been to show how humans originated through evolution.
To summarize what Chris has been teaching, he's looked at the various groupings of bones that have supposedly been found that link man to some pre-man apish type ancestor. Now, all of these are interpreted within some sort of philosophical viewpoint. If you reject the clear statements of the Bible that creatures were made to reproduce after their own kind, then you're going to interpret these variations of apes and these variations of human beings as very different creatures. Now what Chris showed was that those very early creatures, the Australopithecines like Lucy, are clearly ape-like creatures. There's really no contesting that. They're just presented as if they stand upright and are some sort of human ancestor. These creatures like Homo habilis, they're a mixture of bones. There are clearly human bones in there with those ape bones. The creatures later on, like Homo erectus, they are degenerated human beings. Evolution is happening. It is driving things downward to a degeneration, genetic mistakes building up generation after generation. And the inbreeding of human beings leads to a smaller brain capacity and a degenerative body, which is interpreted as some ape turning into a person. And Neanderthal man is clearly fully 100% human. So that's what the bones show. What I'd like to do for a final wrap-up and for a final rebuttal section is go to one of the world's, I believe, most renowned geneticists. He is the man who invented the gene gun, the ability to take genes from the cell of a plant and place them in another plant. This man understands what genetics show and what they lead to. So John Sanford will now look at what do the genetics of apes and humans show us about where we came from to wrap up this session. We've already seen what the bones show. Now let's look at what the very molecules of life show us about where we came from.
My name is John Sanford, and I've been a research scientist all my life. And the first half of my career, I was actually a hardcore evolutionist, and I was absolutely certain about human evolution and that it was a fact. But people change, and a time came when I started to critically examine the idea that man evolved from an ape. And I realized that that's really the main issue with evolution, is not where fruit flies came from or snails came from, but where did people come from? And so that's really the heart of this issue, is were we made miraculously and made in the image of God, or are we descendants of apes, and did we arise by simple natural processes like mutation and selection? When I was certain that human evolution was true, as a geneticist, I would have said the best evidence for human evolution is genetics, my field. And what's interesting now is that has completely flipped, and now the very best evidence against human evolution is genetics. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that. Does the genetic evidence point to human evolution, or does it falsify the claim of human evolution? That's the key message here. And so I'd like to first describe the basic proof claims that evolution is true and that human evolution is a fact. And there are three basic aspects to genetic claims associated with that. First is similarity. And so people say, look, the great apes and man are very similar anatomically and biochemically. And so that's proof that they have a common ancestor. The problem with that is actually that there are a lot of things in the world that we know look very similar, not because they came from a common ancestor, but because by design. For example, My wife and I recently bought a Subaru Forester, and we really like it. And now I'm thinking about buying a little bigger car, a Subaru Ascent. And it's striking how the Ascent looks like just a clone of the Forester, except it's just a little bigger. Would let me use a trailer. And so you go, well, why do they look so similar? Why are they clearly similar shape and style and have the same functions? And the answer is, of course, it's by intelligent design of many engineers and not a product of some type of random trial and error process. So one of the most commonly heard claims about human evolution is that the genome of the chimpanzee and the genome of man are nearly identical. Usually they quote 98% identical. And so genetically we're almost in the same species as chimpanzee. And so it's argued that we're so very similar to chimpanzee. And this claim has been falsified. It's been known to be incorrect for at least 10 years, but it's still in the textbooks. And it's really disturbing that they haven't got this straightened out yet. It's still in the media that we're 98 to 99% identical. And what's happened in the early phases of the genome revolution was they only sampled tiny parts of the genome. And so they would align the parts that lined up, chimp and human, they'd line up those sequences and show how similar they are. There are definitely parts of the genome that are actually identical between human and chimp. And that's not surprising because human and chimp have a lot of the same basic biochemistry. But what those early studies didn't use was to show the areas that were different. So a lot of the genome of the human and chimp don't align at all. In other words, their homology is zero. There are sequences that are unique to human and sequences that are unique to chimp. And so you can't just choose areas that line up and then say they're very similar. You have to look at the whole genome. As people have been looking at the whole genome and not selectively using the most similar aspects of the genome, it's now clear that the human and chimp genome are different by at least 10%. That is, they're only 80 to 90% identical. Now, that still might sound quite similar, but we're talking about like 300 million letter differences in the genome of chimp and the genome of man. So this has been a huge reversal. The whole 98 to 99% identical has been overthrown, it's been refuted, and it's just now really the obligation of textbooks and media to let the public know the truth. Let me just read a quote on this in regards to the 98, 99% identity. In a paper published in 2012, so the evidence for differences between the genomes has grown since then. But this is what the author says. It is now clear that the genetic differences between human and chimpanzee are far more extensive than previously thought. Their genomes are not 98 to 99% identical. So that's something that we can put at rest. But there's a deeper level to that problem. And I'm just going to go to a few more quotes here, because people in the field, even evolutionists, acknowledge that man and ape are profoundly different. So here's a quote from paleo expert. He says, "It is not that difficult to tell a human from an ape, after all. The human is the one who's walking, talking, sweating, praying, building, reading, trading, crying, dancing, writing, cooking, joking, working, and decorating." So that's really important for people to understand, is that anatomically there are some similarities, but if you're looking for a good companion, you wouldn't hang out with a chimp, you'd hang out with a human being. And so we're profoundly different, and actually people don't know exactly what makes us different. It's probably, the human soul probably isn't encoded by a gene. There's something deeper. Here's another quote. "We are unique and alone now in the world. There is no other animal species that truly resembles our own. A physical and mental chasm separates us from all other living creatures. There is no bipedal mammal. There is no other mammal that controls and uses fire, writes books, travels in space, paints portraits, or prays. It's not a question of degree." In other words, we're fundamentally different. And so if we don't recognize that, we're blind. And there are people who are blind. They'd say, we're just really clever chimpanzees. No, we're something very special. And we have a soul. evolutionists will freely acknowledge that the similarities in life could be by design and not by descent, by common descent. But they say, oh, but we have, we can break the tie. We can still prove evolution is true because we can show that the genomes of chimp have mistakes that are identical to mistakes in the human genome. And so, whereas functional aspects of the genome could be by design, by God wouldn't deliberately engineer mistakes or broken genes into the chimp and human genomes. So this has been considered their bulletproof argument. And so what's interesting is their argument of shared mistakes is based upon the premise that most of the human genome is junk, that the human genome is just filled with junk. And what's interesting is that paradigm, which kind of reigned for 1 or 2 decades, has been completely overthrown by the ENCODE project. And so the ENCODE project is this huge consortium of geneticists who have been looking at the human genome and how it differs from the chimp genome. And what they're finding is all the junk has function. And so the fact that if most of the genome is functional, then you have to use your shared mistakes argument very carefully, because of what you're calling shared mistakes may be shared functions that we don't yet understand. And so that's really becoming crystal clear. So 2005, there was the Dover trial, and basically intelligent design or creation was under attack. And it was based upon the idea that a school district wanted to be able to teach the pros and cons of evolution. They simply wanted to let there be dialogue in the classroom. So the Dover trial was really a turning point, and very much in a negative sense, in that basically a lot of things were claimed that were clearly wrong. For example, hemoglobin is essential for our life. It gives us red blood and picks up oxygen. And so that family of genes has one gene that they say is a piece of junk DNA. It's a broken gene, it's a pseudogene, it doesn't make protein. It's called beta globin, and the hemoglobin has multiple functional protein units. So they say, okay, here's our proof, because exactly the same broken gene is in chimpanzee. Wow, that's conclusive proof that both chimp and human inherited a mistake from a previous ancestor, and that is the silver bullet for them. The interesting thing is that the beta globin story has been totally reversed since the Dover trial. Completely reversed. What they found is that this pseudogene, the beta globin pseudogene, is essential for life, and it's not junk. It actually makes RNA, which regulates the rest of the hemoglobin genes. So it's absolutely essential for human life and for chimpanzee life, and it's not junk, and it's not a shared mistake. And that's been shown in high-level journals. This isn't like a contested point. So it wouldn't be surprising then that both humans and chimps would share that gene, because it's a shared function, and functions come from design. Continuing on the shared mistakes theme, probably the most famous piece of junk DNA in the human genome is called the ALU sequence, and it's also found in the chimpanzee genome. And it's a fairly short piece of DNA sequence, but it exists in the human genome in an enormous number of copies, over 1 million copies throughout the genome. It makes up 10% of the human genome. And it's assumed to be not just junk DNA, but it's been assumed to be selfish, parasitic DNA. This is like a self-promoting, self-replicating, almost like a virus that spreads through the genome and actually is very disruptive. And so what's interesting is in just the last few years, there have been huge breakthroughs. And what they found is that this sequence doesn't have a function, it has many, many functions. It's saturated with function, and it's saturated with information. And so the ALU story is so interesting, and it's so exactly opposite what's been taught, that it's striking. The details of all the ways it functions are in the book, in the Contested Bones book. There's a whole chapter on genetics. And what's interesting is, of course, they're in the same location because they have the same function, and where you're positioned on the chromosome matters. And so this whole argument, shared mistakes argument, collapses as we realize that it's not all junk DNA, and that in fact the exact examples that were used as their very best arguments have now been falsified. Not just falsified, flipped. So they go from being a powerful argument against design and for evolution to a powerful argument against evolution and for design. So amazing turn of events. And so the Dover trial was an incredible miscarriage of justice. It's really tragic what happened there, but history will vindicate those who were saying no, similarities are due to design. I'd like to just look at one more issue to the shared mistakes argument, and that is this issue of the junk DNA. So ENCODE is this huge project, right, funded by the federal government, and it's basically asking where are the functions within the genome? Is it what parts are junk and what aren't? And of course, what they found was that it's overwhelmingly the genome is functional. It's not primarily junk DNA. A really famous evolutionist was quoted recently as saying, if ENCODE is true, evolution is false. And I thank him for saying that because it's exactly right. If the genome is mostly functional, then evolution fails. And there are multiple reasons why that logic follows, but it's really interesting to see an evolutionist say, if we lose the ENCODE battle, then we lose the whole game. We're in ENCODE 3, phase 3 now, and they just keep finding more and more function. And they're just stunned. Not that there's a function, but there's overlapping functions. There are just codes overlapping codes, and it's like the deeper they dig, the more it's clear that the genome is a masterpiece of design. Lastly, I'd like to talk about maybe the most famous supposed proof of chimp-human common ancestry, which is the chromosome 2 fusion. It reputedly is the result of 2 chimpanzee chromosomes that fused. And so that's been used as a proof, but what's interesting is just recently, in the last few years, it's been completely refuted, and it's just amazing how science, when you dig deeper, can give very different results. So Dr. Jeff Tompkins is the person who studied this in greatest depth, and he began by studying a little piece of DNA, just a few hundred base pairs long, tiny piece of the genome, which has been claimed to be the exact place where the 2 chromosomes fused. And they see signals that seem to indicate that there was a fusion there. And what he's done is he's shown that short sequence, number one, it has similar sequences throughout the genome. And then the second thing is he's shown that the fusion site has a function. So normally if you fuse 2 chromosomes, you don't get a functional gene, you get a nonsense sequence. And so what he's shown is the reputed fusion site is within a functional gene. Right in the middle of that gene is the reputed fusion site. It's within an intron of that gene. And it turns out as he studied that piece of the gene more carefully, what he discovers is the thing they're calling a reputed fusion site is actually a promoter. And it initiates transcription of an alternative RNA from that gene. So it's clearly not a fusion site, part of a functional gene. And Dr. Tompkins' results are stunning, and his evidences are multidimensional. So basically, the claim that we have a smoking gun and we can see exactly where there was a fusion has been falsified. The exciting thing here is that the fusion hypothesis has been used as an argument for evolution for decades, and it's been overturned. And it's just clear that hypothesis fails now. And so that's really exciting for those people who are skeptical of evolution. So that's the bottom line is, so similarity, shared mistakes, chromosome 2 fusion have historically been very powerful arguments. They've all been discredited in the recent past by God's grace.
I have just 6 more minutes of stuff to add to what they did so well. The question that many will ask is, well, are chimps just our closest known living relative? Why are most scientists so intent on interpreting ape and human fossils as transition from one to another? That was the first question we had this evening up there. Why? Why are they so intent on having human fossils and ape fossils merge somewhere?
Evolution.
It's their career.
It is their career. It is their.
They're too invested in it to change them.
They're too invested in it, and it's their belief system. It's their worldview.
So it's not science.
It's not science.
The thing, Scott, that, you know, and I realize everyone in this room understands this, but they laugh at us for believing in myths, and yet they want us to deduce that everything came from nothing, and you can throw all this stuff down without any designer or anything, and it just magically appears. That's the nonsense. But why people don't catch on to that, I guess.
Because they don't want to believe that they're responsible to a God either.
Yeah.
Now, there's a few that they didn't mention, and I'm only going to cover a couple of them. Nebraska Man. I know this was used by Clarence Darrow in the Scopes monkey trial to dumbfound William Jennings Bryan. Now, what he presented is, we found this half-man, half-ape skeleton, basically bones, and what do you say to that? And Bryan said, I don't know. Now, the truth of the matter is, they only found a single tooth. And it was found. Yeah, Bryan was not told any evidence. They were implied a full skeleton. Now, this picture appeared in the papers in 1922, included in the Illustrated London News, showing not only the full ape man, but also his family. This all was from what? One tooth. Is this science or artwork?
Oh, it's artwork.
It's artwork. Now, incidentally, 10 years later, they found a jawbone that the tooth fit into, and it was the jaw of a pig.
Cool.
Piltdown Man, 45 people got their PhD studying Piltdown Man over a 50-year period. The last person to do it did an absorption fluoride test. When he did it, he found somebody had used chemicals to yellow the skull. When they did further testing, they found that the skull was about 40 to 50 years old. It was the same date of death as when the thing was found. It was not thousands or millions of years old.
Oh, another fake.
This is an outright fraud. What they found when they looked at the teeth on the bottom, this was the first person to look at the teeth under a microscope, found out the teeth had been filed. This was an outright fraud. Cro-Magnon, declared transitional between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens by evolutionists, characteristics identical to modern humans. Now here's a big point. You see that right there, with a better haircut, could this be any human being? It could. Neanderthals, Cro-Magnon, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens are all human. They made the great case for Neanderthals being human. I always remember a presentation I did 30 years ago, in which I had 4 medical doctors practicing who were in those seminar I was doing. And I asked them, I said, can Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal be human? And one of them said, I've had all 4 of those skull types walk into my office this week. Because there's wide variation in terms of human anatomy and the human skull. Now Lucy, also known as Australopithecus afarensis. Now, they only talked about Johansen. This set of bones was originally found by Richard Leakey, the son of the famous Mary and Louis Leakeys. He didn't believe that it was anything but an ape. But Johansen said, no, this is a transitional. It's only a 40% find. It has a given skull configuration, but no snout. And you saw a lot of evidence tonight that it simply may be a collage of human and ape pieces put together. Because it was the 67 bones that they put together were among 470. Now here's a real good look at what was found by Lucy. Incidentally, on the screen, she's bigger than normal. This thing was only about 2 3/4 to 3 feet tall. My wife saw an actual reproduction of this when we were at the Wonder Center outside of Nashville in Dixon, Tennessee. And she said, this doesn't prove anything to me, and it shouldn't. One of Terry's big pet peeves is that if you go to the St. Louis Field Museum, you will see what they produced up here in that she will have completely human feet. How many feet bone are there?
None, zero.
Nada? Yeah. And then they said, well, we know she had to have human feet because we saw another type of Australopithecus afarensis walking around in Laoteli. Wait a minute, how far away was that? 1,000 miles. Boy, I don't have enough faith for that. They make her look thoughtful and a whole lot of other things, but the basis is when they did a computer analysis of her hip and leg bone that we have, whether this was a collage of human and ape, this thing was a tree dweller.
It was a what?
A tree dweller. It like a chimp or an orangutan, it could walk upright, but it wasn't good at it. Skull fragments were found 1 mile away. Well, how could you even put that with this animal? Well, they were anatomically similar.
Get in here, get in there.
Yeah, a toe was found 10 miles away. Throw him in the mix. Lucy's knee was found 10 miles away in strata 200 feet deeper. What's 200 feet deeper supposed to mean?
Different area.
Millions of years older. And again, this is the point. When you have an ape, they have a straight leg bone. Whereas if you're dealing with a human, they have an angle to support greater weight when you're standing up. The bone that was represented, the femur that was represented there, was a straight bone. It was ape-like. Now, Jeff Tompkins did good science. As they talked about 30 years ago, they came out this data, or this finding, that we were only about 1.5% different from a chimp. We're basically a chimp. Now, the way they did that was they assumed that anything besides a gene was junk DNA. And genes, the things that code for proteins in us, only make up about 1.5% of the genome. So, they took a look at the genes only, and if certain parts of the genome, if certain chromosomes, etc., were certain areas or pairs were different, they simply threw those out. And they only compared the ones that were somewhat similar. And out of that, they got us 98.5% the same. When Tompkins redid, because this is what good science does, you publish, and then you have people repeat your experiments to prove that you get the same result. Do good science. When he repeated the science, but this time, not just looking at the genes, but looking at the entire genome, he found that we are somewhere between 70 and 90% different from a chimp. If his worst case scenario was true that we were 70% different, that's 900 million base pairs.
70% different or only 70% the same?
Huh?
70% different or only 70%?
70% the same, 30% different. The recent data they have is we're anywhere between 90% similar and 80% similar, which would be 10 to 20% difference. Most of the experiments they're getting in this right now show us to be at least 15% different or 85% similar. But if all you're talking about is 15% different, you're talking about almost 500 million base pairs. If you had 500 million different letters in a book, you'd call it what? A different book. Now, one of the interesting things about all these missing links is they have a lifespan. Java Man was found in 1891. 30 years later, it's just a giant gibbon. Piltdown Man, 1912 to the 1950s, they figured out it was a fraud. Peking Man was found in 1930. By 1946, all we had was 2 human teeth. So they used to talk about Peking Man as being a Homo erectus, just like Java Man.
How can a responsible scientist publish something that's stupid?
Well, here's the problem. Originally, they found a bunch of fragmented telling the story of Peking Man, they found a bunch of fragmented ape skulls. And they found some complete human skulls. The human skulls were in the upper cave. The ape skulls, the fragmented ape skulls, were in the lower cave, along with parts from each one. One of the problems that they had, that Rupert was discussing, and also is almost always true, is when you find these things, they're disarticulated, they're broken up. And you have to take out of the jigsaw what's there and what's not. So originally, they had all these human skulls, they had all those ape skulls and ape pieces in China, near Peking, Chukotka. During World War II, the Japanese invade, and now everything's gone except for 2 human teeth. So there's no evidence. They're going by word of mouth of what was originally found. There were some molds of these things, but no real evidence. Nebraska man, 1922, 10 years later, he's a pig. Lucy, 1974, by 1990, we knew he was a tree dweller that walks pearly. But has that stopped Lucy from being in the textbooks? Not at all. The Bible says we were specially created, and science has nothing to contradict this fact. Geneticists, in fact, supports this claim, which is what Dr. Sanford talked about. Sanford was noted as the leading plant geneticist in the world until he committed one sin. What was his sin?
Creationism.
He converted to Christianity because of what he found. He found the design. And then he was outspoken creationist, and the whole community that noted that he was the authority in the world on plant genetics said, okay, you're nuts. Why are most scientists so intent on interpreting it? Oh, we've already talked about that. The majority of people polled in America now believe that some sort of ape turned into a human. Why do you think this is the case?
If you're always presented with that one side, that's what you're going to believe.
It's not just propaganda, Terry, although that's true. It is, what have they been taught for 50 years? On PBS, on television, in movies, in their schools. This is what they've been taught. That's why he told the story he did at the start. I do have tonight all of these contested bones and genetic entropy by Sanford. Sanford, even though genetics is very complex, Sanford is not a great orator. You know, he's very soft-spoken, but his book is pretty clear. You do not have to have a degree in genetics to understand Sanford's book, Genetic Entropy. Your thoughts on all of this?
I'd like to comment a little bit about they talked about the Dover trial. I wrote an article on this, but Judge Jones, before the Dover trial, had previously struck down a Pennsylvania law that said a marriage was between one man and one woman.
There you go.
And so that trial was decided before they were started. It was decided with the selection of the judge.
Yeah.
And this is why, as a matter of fact, Judge Jones, and I think these ladies here could help inform us, but there's different Lutheran synods, and he's, is that how you pronounce it?
You did.
Okay, he's one that accepts theistic evolution.
ELCA.
Okay, ELCA, and as well as the LGBTQIA plus agenda and all of that. And yet he and his ruling was in line with the tenets of his own church denomination, but yet he goes around making speeches about how he kept religion out of the science room and stood up for the First Amendment. And this is why it's
really is a big deal. When they have a law, or when they say that a judge has to perform these so-called same-sex marriages, what are they saying? Well, they're saying that if you want to be a judge, you've got to be accepting of these so-called same-sex marriages. Well, how is that going to affect you on these other rulings too? I mean, that's the...
It could. The bigger impact of the Dover trial was that it set the precedent that the Bible and religion is only religion and not science, and only evolution is science. What they were given a high bar by Judge Jones. The high bar was, it is already assumed that evolution is true science. You must prove to me that creation science is science. And they couldn't do it to his satisfaction. Again, there was bad evidence here. What Sanford overspoke about that was, it wasn't that they wanted to actually teach creation in the public schools. The state had passed a law that said, teach evolution all you want. We recommend that you teach both and let the kids decide. But when you teach evolution, all you need to do is have one paragraph read at the start of the hour and then teach evolution the whole hour. That's no problem. The statement that they were required to read that was overturned in that 2005 Dover decision was that evolution is a simple theory and we do not know yet whether that's the truth. If you want to hear counter arguments to evolution, there's a book in the library called The Pandas and People, and you can go check it out. And then they could go teach evolution all day. And that's what was objected to, and that was what was before. The problem was the amount of precedent that's now being followed with that. Anything else?
I want to remind everyone that there is a great conspirator. There is someone who's orchestrating this information in the mind of those who don't know God. The Satan is a liar, and he was a liar from the start. While these facts are saline and relative to your conversation with them, make sure you take people back to God's morality. Are they a good person? Do they have the Ten Commandments written on their hearts? And when you get there, they can get to heaven from there.
Yes, sir.
Comment about those Lutherans that did that, being of the other branches of Lutherans for myself. The ELCA, which was a merger of a number of different Lutheran groups, three to be precise, in 1988 to form the biggest Lutheran group in the United States, has lost half its membership. I mean, so they are, and they keep going the rate they're going to be going. In the next 25 years, there's not going to be an ELCA. They're going to have to change their name.
Which group is this church?
Oh, this is a small.
This one you got two members back there.
This is ELS. ELS.
Ladies, is that true?
Yeah.
Yeah, y'all are ELS.
ELS will back this one up 100%. What you got on the screen there.
Yeah.
But the ELCA is a total disaster.
Yeah.
And but there are other Lutheran groups that don't agree with these evolutions, and that would be the WELS, the WELS, and the LCMS officially doesn't agree with evolution.
This is what happens whenever you get compromised in your theology.
Oops, you got that.
Yeah. The Methodist Church, why is it declining in terms of membership? Because they're highly compromised.
Well, they just split.
Why does Catholicism have all the problems they've got? Because they've now become highly compromised. For a while, they were holding the fort on some things.
They were.
But their recent popes have given up on that. There are only two groups in America which are expanding today, are holding firm in terms of membership. Who are they? Southern Baptists and evangelical Bible churches. Anything else? All right, I thank y'all for being here. I hope this was beneficial. beneficial to you. We will look at the dinosaurs in the Bible next month. I previewed his presentation, and it's intriguing. He'll ask you a lot the question, which makes sense? And these are the questions he asked himself as he was looking through these things. Let's close in prayer. Again, we do have the free materials back there, and some paid, and the rest of the paid materials are up here, including the books that were talked about during the video. Let's pray. Lord God, thank you for this time. Thank you for all the grace you give us. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for bringing us into your fellowship and your family. Protect these people as they go home. And thank you again for being the great God that you are. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.